A Death You Can't Rhyme. Written by DontLikeApplebees. I didn't feel any trepidation about visiting my half-brother until I got off the interstate. I had been fine on the flight from New York to Tampa, relaxed at the rental car agency, and even delighted in driving downtown by the city skyline. But as I passed the eastern suburbs and got off the exit for Ruskin and headed east, I got a feeling way down in my stomach that was either caused by emotion or cilantro, and I hadn't had any of the latter in quite some time. Motoring through the retirement community of Sun City was pleasant enough, and it still made me feel like I was near modern civilization. But once I got past that, and then to the small town of Wimauma, civilization began to thin out in a hurry. I drove on for a little while and passed through a town called Fort Lonesome that, as far as I know, only consists of a convenience store and an electrical substation. There is truth in advertising, I thought to myself. Not long after that, I crossed the county line and entered Polk County. That's where I began to look for the white mailbox on the left-hand side of the road, which would indicate where Dean's driveway started. The cilantro feeling remained in full effect. He had forewarned me in his email that I should rent a four-wheel drive vehicle. The roads were all paved, he had said, but his driveway was a mile long and only part gravel. Once I found the driveway and started up it, I realized what he meant. There was some gravel on it in places, but the rest was a pockmarked, dirty path with a barbed wire cattle fence on either side. The rental agency's idea of a four-wheel drive vehicle had been an all-wheel drive Ford EcoSport. I'd been okay with the little SUV in Tampa, but bouncing slowly down the rutted country driveway of my half-brother's ranch in this stubby, four-cylinder EcoBox wannabe SUV, well, I was feeling pretty ridiculous. I was really beginning to just want this visit over with so that I could head back to the city, put my feet up in my room in the Marriott, and then attend the dental convention tomorrow. But I hadn't seen Dean in a long, long time, except for his fleeting appearance at our father's funeral last year. I had figured that if I was about to trip over the big 4-0 milestone, then Dean had to be somewhere in his early 50s. Now was the time to get to know him again and to have some part of my dad still in my life. My rolling embarrassment crested a small rise, and finally, I saw Dean's house. It was a tan, stucco-clad ranch house with no real adornment or style, except for a shady front porch that ran along most of the front. As far as I could tell, the house hadn't been updated since the mid-60s when my father had built it. Dean was sitting on the front porch as I pulled up. I watched him stand up and move out into the afternoon sun. Dean, unlike yours truly, was the spitting image of our father. He was short, lean, black-haired, hawk-nosed, and gray-eyed. Dean was tan from working out in the sun, and he was lean-muscled. Those were the only attributes that differed between him and Dad. I parked next to two pickups that had to be at least 30 years old and proceeded to unfold myself out of the rental trucklet. My looks were completely those of my mother's side of the family. Tall, blonde-haired, wide-shouldered, and blue-eyed. I had 7 inches and 100 pounds on Dean easily. He reached out a hand and I took it. It was weird to see so much of Dad in Dean, and it made me smile. "Good to see you again, kiddo." Dean smiled warmly. When I had been a little kid, Dean had come up to New York every summer for 2 weeks as part of the custody agreement. He had been very good to me. I remember being sad when he turned 18 and stopped visiting. But a flood of positive memories from childhood came back when he called me kiddo. I had admired him then, and I had wanted so much to have him around as a full-time big brother. We shook hands and then he motioned towards the house. "It ain't much, but it's home." he said as he held open the screen door for me and let me inside. Actually, Dad always talked about the ranch as though he'd built a palace down here, I said. Dean offered me a beer and then seemed to think about my statement. Yeah, I suppose it was a decent house in the 60s, and it sure is a lot bigger than that little New York City apartment that you grew up in. I laughed. Do you know what that apartment is going for nowadays? The rent is about the same as 5 generous car payments a month. I looked around the outdated but clean kitchen. I really wouldn't mind some space like this, I said. Well, you gotta earn the land to live out here and earn your keep with Mother Nature. You know what, let's take a ride and catch up while I give you a tour of the ranch. We had something out here happen this week that I want to show you. We got into one of the pickups that I'd seen out front, and it fired up with a momentary squeal from one of the belts and then settled into a lopsided idle. I must have looked concerned. No worries, said Dean. I drive this truck out there every day to drop the hay, and she's never failed me. Now, the ranch was much bigger than I thought. The driveway and its surrounding fields were actually the narrowest part of the property. Once you got past the house, the land stretched on as far as the eye could see to the left and to the right and straight ahead. Dean and I chatted about our lives while we drove to the perimeter and visited his herds. Your dad, Dean started, not exactly claiming ownership of the father who had moved out when he was 4. Got this land very, very cheap from one of the strip mining companies here back in the 1960s. It was considered unsuitable for mining, so he snapped it up and created the ranch. He may have been just a dentist from New York, no offense, but he did know his real estate. I might be able to retire next year. Don't get fooled by the trucks or the house. I save as many pennies as I can. If my mama was still alive or I felt like dating, I would update the house and get a new truck. I'm planning on selling this ranch when I turn 55 and then getting a place in Tennessee. I'm done with the Florida heat. Oh, and I'm done with Florida sinkholes too. The sun was starting to set, but we could still see well enough when Dean brought the truck to a stop by what looked like a pond. Take a look at that, Dean urged me. What, the pond? I asked. That, kiddo, is a sinkhole that's filled up with water. It opened up last week. The county came out and surveyed it and told me that it had stabilized. Nothing else to worry about, they tell me. It's far enough away from the house anyway, but it makes me wonder if I'll have any more. It was at that point that I looked towards the setting sun and I saw a small wisp of smoke. Hey, what's that smoke from? I pointed. What? Hold on. Dean whipped the truck into reverse, the suspension groaning as he pulled a 3-point turn. And then we rocketed off in the direction of the smoke. If a brush fire started out here, we're in for a long night, kiddo. It turned out that a small brush fire had started on the property adjacent to Dean's back fence. Dean took a fire extinguisher from behind the pickup's bench seat and carefully worked his way through the cattle fence. He had the tiny blaze out pretty quickly. He then pulled out a satellite phone. I was stunned that he had such a piece of technology, but then I realized that we were too far from any cell towers. He called his neighbor and he let them know about the fire. He seemed satisfied with the answer that his neighbor had given him, and we climbed back into the truck and waited on our side of the fence until his neighbor came up the fence on an ATV. He gave Dean a wave that apparently said, "Thanks, I'll keep an eye on it." Dean waved back, started the truck, and flipped on the headlights as dusk had now settled upon us. I was updating him on my mother's retirement to Boca Raton after Dad died, and how I had already increased revenue in the family's dental practice by 22% since Dad had left it to me. Then, Dean suddenly stopped the truck. He was looking past me, out the side window. I turned and looked. Over the sinkhole that we'd looked at earlier were bright orange flying specks that had to be bugs. They were reflective, I thought at first, remembering how some flies had iridescent green on their bodies. But the sun was almost down, and the truck's headlights weren't shining in that direction. "Lightning bugs? Fireflies?" I asked. Dean reached under the truck's seat, felt around for a moment, and came up with a spotlight that plugged into the truck's cigarette lighter. "Nope," Dean grunted out as he searched for the light. "We don't have them this far south. They're only in northern Florida. And they flash white. And even then, they're very rare." I rolled my windows down so that Dean could shine the light. The high-intensity beam came on, nearly blinding me. Dean leaned in closer to me, and the light was now past my face and closer to the opened window. "Would you look at that?" Dean murmured as he played the light over the sinkhole and not the bugs. From our vantage point, the sinkhole appeared to be empty. The water was gone. "I take it that that's not normal for a sinkhole," I said. "Nope. The water table is very high in most of Florida, which is why we don't have basements. That should be full of water." Dean shut off the light and unplugged it. "I'll have to call the county in the morning and have them come back out. If a sinkhole opened up under my sinkhole, then this area is probably unstable and we should stay back." "Funny," I said in full deadpan. "I feel the same way about my ex-wife." Dean looked at me for a second and then burst out laughing. Back at the house a few minutes later, we decided to have another beer and chat a little more before I made my drive back to Tampa. We really hadn't talked in any significant way in years, not since childhood. I listened to his tales of growing up out here on the ranch, and I was amazed at how different our lives really were. My father had been a novice cattle rancher down here, while up north he had been a conservative dentist who had an office just north of Soho and one out in Astoria. I never understood why he moved to Florida to start a ranch after dental school, and Dean really didn't understand either. Just when I was thinking that it was time for me to go, and regretting that thought since the cilantro filling was now gone, I looked out the back door of the kitchen. We'd left the inside door open to catch the Florida in November 65-degree evening breeze. I noticed a lizard hanging on the screen door. I knew that geckos were common in Florida, but not glowing, bright orange ones. "Dean," I said, "look at the door. Is that normal?" Dean stood up, walked to my side of the room, and looked at the screen door. "What the? No, it's not normal." Dean approached the screen door and tapped on the screen with his beer can to scare the gecko off. The orange gecko climbed down the screen quickly, but instead of heading for the ground outside, it found a small hole in the screen towards the bottom and came through into the kitchen. Dean jumped back as the lizard scampered across the linoleum tires, headed for the living room. I looked at Dean and shrugged. He gave me a look that said, "Heck if I know." He started towards the doorway to the living room when there was that noise that cats make when you step on their tail. We both made our way to follow the sound, which was coming from the living room. As we entered the living room, the cat's angry vocalizations turned into a horrible meowing. The gecko was lying on the floor, but something was wrong with it. It took me a second to realize that it didn't have any skin, and it was squirming on the avocado-colored carpeting in what was its final death throes. The cat, however, was rolling around on the carpet, trying to rub off the orange, glowing slime that had coated its entire back half. As we watched, the cat began to whirl and whip around in one place as the orange substance crawled further up its body. Dean turned to me and asked for a large towel from the bathroom. I realized that he was going to try and catch it. Finding the bathroom wasn't hard, and I came back with a towel in what had to be less than a minute. Upon entering the room, I realized that the meowing and thrashing had stopped. I looked over Dean's shoulder as I approached. The cat was all glowing orange now, and it stood there staring at us. Dean didn't ask for the towel, and I didn't offer it. Neither of us wanted to touch the thing. Slowly, as we watched, the orange cat shape started to pulse a little bit. Within another few seconds, small orange protrusions started to form on the cat's back. They looked like the wings of a fly. Within another few seconds, the wings began to flutter. They then really picked up speed, and the cat actually started to lift up off the floor. "Walk away slowly. Don't turn your back on it," Dean said quietly. "Go through the kitchen and then out the back door, and go around the house towards your car. I'm going to get my gun. I'll meet you out there." "Where is your—" "Shh. Just go." We backed away slowly and made it to the doorway that led to the kitchen when the flying cat thing stopped hovering and began flying. We ducked as it headed for us, weaving and bopping up and down in the air as it came. It was either drunk or still learning how to fly. It went over our heads and hit one of the walls in the kitchen. It then fell onto the kitchen table, knocking over empty beer cans and a bowl of pretzels as it floundered to get back on its feet and get airborne again. "Get outside now," Dean yelled at me while he ran down the hall towards, I assume, his gun safe or gun rack. I ran back through the living room, slammed open the front door screen, and found myself out on the porch. Dean's dog, an old, deaf chocolate lab, whose name was either Marley or Barley, stood up with some effort at my sudden appearance. I ignored the poor dog and made my way out into the yard. I heard nothing for a few moments, and then 2 gunshots sounded inside the house. Dean came running out the front door seconds later, looking over his shoulder as he ran towards me. "What happened?" I asked him. Before he could answer, the flying, glowing cat flew through the front screen door and out onto the porch. The dog, who was watching us and not the door, didn't hear the sound and was completely taken by surprise when the cat landed and latched onto his back. "Farley!" Dean cried out and tried to run to the dog, but I held him back. Already, the orange substance was leaching off the cat and onto Farley. The dog started to roll on the ground to try to get the cat off, but it was already too late. The cat's skinless, mutilated corpse fell off Farley's back as the orange substance began to cover his entire body. He howled as the substance crept up his throat, and Dean stepped forward and raised his gun. "I'm sorry, buddy." Dean took aim and fired at Farley. What happened next was so rapid fire that I'm not sure how much I actually saw and how much my brain filled in. The bullet entered the dog's body through the orange goop and passed through the dog, and then came out the other side, trailing a line of that orange stuff with it. Then, the substance reached a point of tautness and slingshotted the bullet back through the dog. The orange-coated bullet hit Dean square in the chest, trailing more and more of the orange along with it. Dean went over on his back, just a few feet in front of me. I was at his side in a second. His mouth was moving, but there were no words coming out. He was staring right at me, his gray eyes reminding me so much of my father's again. There was also no blood. There was a glowing orange hole in his chest. I looked at it for a moment and then back at his face. Dean's pupils split, and then split again, and then again. I started to get up and back away. As I watched, his pupils kept splitting until they looked like fly eyes. His mouth stopped moving and he started to sit up. I backed up further. Orange goo started to leak from his pores as he started to get to his feet. The Dean thing was unsteady at first, But that's all I watched. I turned and I ran for the rental. I started to feel my pants pockets as I ran, feeling for the key fob. It was there and I pulled it out as I neared the EcoSport. The parking lights flashed amber as the doors unlocked and I got into the tiny vehicle as fast as I could. I fumbled for the lock switch and found it, and then looked out the side window. Dean was all orange now, and he was walking in my direction. Rather, he was loping in my direction. He looked hunched over, and it looked like he was about to run on all fours. And then I saw his face. It was elongated like a dog's muzzle, and it still had the fly eyes. I started the motor of the rental trucklet and backed up. There was nothing that I could do but run. I knew that then and there that I was next. Every iteration of this orange thing was a step up. It always went for something bigger each time. I was bigger than Dean, and I was the closest living creature. I floored the accelerator, kicking up dirt and rocks on the Dean thing. I tried to speed down the driveway, but the potholes and washouts slowed me down. In the rearview mirror, I saw the orange form chasing me was now on 4 legs and moving faster. I was almost sure that a long, thick lizard tail was trailing from behind it. The faster that I tried to go, the more I got shaken and bounced around in the long, dilapidated driveway. The orange thing that had been my half-brother was now gaining on me. The little Ford suspension kept bottoming out with horrible sounds. And in the back of my head were 2 voices that ultimately led me to my next move. Thank God that I paid for full coverage rental insurance, and I have to distract Dean with something else so that I can escape. Bam! I saw 2 thick posts and wood gates that broke up the otherwise endless litany of barbed wire fence on my left, and I drove right into it. It wasn't a particularly solid wood gate, and suddenly the EcoSport was on flat, grassy grazing land. It started to pick up speed, and I looked in the rearview mirror again. The Dean thing had changed again. It was now more cat-like, but still had the long lizard tail. But it also had wing-like protrusions on its back. It cleared the broken gate and was now closing in on me. I looked ahead again. Fate intervened on my behalf. There was a small group of cattle dead ahead, if I could make it there in time. The EcoSport's most likely cracked headlight lenses weren't throwing the best light, but I thought that I could make it. I did. I made it to the small herd, and that flying gecko cat Farley Dean orange generic combo creature pounced onto one of the cattle. I felt guilty for a moment, but then I realized that we had bigger problems. We, as in all of North America, or we the people of Earth. I had forgotten that there had been a swarm of 30 to 40 of those orange flies over the sinkhole, and it seemed from what I could see at the moment that other genetic combos had arisen from other corners of Dean's ranch. There were several glowing orange cattle far out there on the property already, but also other things. Some of them were flying and weaving around. Some of them were round and rolling like a giant hog. Dean's ranch didn't just have cattle, but also goats, pigs, chickens, a few horses, and even a donkey. God only knew what DNA combinations were now milling about out there in the dark. I didn't stop to watch. I drove towards where I thought the driveway was, and I punched the accelerator down hard. When I hit the cattle fence, it felt like it wasn't going to give for a second. The EcoSport hung almost in midair, but then the fence relented, and I was deposited out on the main road about 6 feet from the mailbox. I lurched to a stop on the center line of the road. I laughed out loud, just like I had the day that my Amazon stock went over $1,500 per share, and then I took off down the road. I blew through Fort Lonesome, doing at least 80 miles per hour, trying to figure out what my next move was. Call the police? Would they believe me? What could they do? Maybe the military. Same results there. right? The sound of Dean's voice calling me kiddo and smiling at me with my father's face played over and over in my head. And I kept whispering to myself, nothing I could do, nothing I could do, nothing I could do. When I got to Wimama, I slowed down as I finally accepted that nothing was chasing me. The EcoSport must have looked awful, I thought, as I heard something that sounded like a piece of barbed wire being dragged somewhere underneath. I needed not to get pulled over by the police. I needed to leave Florida now. As Wimama ended and Sun City began, I called my airline. I told the customer service agent that I had a family emergency and needed to get back to New York tonight. They switched my thirsty return flight to tonight and told me that if I could get to the airport and through security lines in an hour, I would make the flight. Once on the interstate, I ran the little car up to almost 85 miles per hour and was still not really outpacing all the traffic around me. It was after 8 o'clock, and I went from I-75 to I-4 to I-275 with almost no slowing down. At the airport, I just dropped the rental car in the short-term parking garage and called the rental agency from my cell, telling them that I had a family emergency and to bill my credit card for the parking costs. I didn't mention the damage, figuring that the world was coming to an end and I'd paid for insurance. They could suck it up and deal with it before they got absorbed by giant glowing orange cattle that flew and sucked their DNA to its ever-growing mixture. My carry-on bags were still packed from the flight down earlier today. With them slung over my shoulder, I walked into the departure concourse and used the airline's self-check-in kiosk to print out my new boarding pass. I had paid for TSA pre-check years ago, so I was through security in less than 10 minutes. I took the monorail over to my gate and walked up to the counter as they were calling final boarding. The flight was not full at all because who was flying to New York from Florida when it was below freezing up there? And I had a full row of seats to myself near the back of the plane. I settled down into the window seat and buckled up, and I went into a state of denial as the safety demonstration started and we taxied away from the gate. Even though my phone was supposed to be off, I left it on and kept checking the local Tampa Bay news sites. There was no mention of anything. No developing or breaking news story about orange creatures attacking people. No giant sinkholes opening up and swallowing portions of Polk County. No military convoys leading MacDill and heading inland to fight an unknown military. As the plane took off, I began to wonder if Dean was still alive. Maybe I'd hallucinated everything. Maybe there was something in Dean's homebrewed beer. Maybe he stood there watching me take off in my car, watching me destroy his fence. The seat back in front of me had a little LCD TV screen in it where I could watch satellite TV or listen to music with my earphones. By default, it was showing an informational channel where it flipped through a rotating display of weather conditions, advertisements, and a map of Florida showing the plane's current location. I watched the little plane on the screen head south on the map and then turn eastwards to complete a gradual U-turn to head north. It felt like my eyes had the realization before my brain did. The plane was turning east, over towards the Hillsborough-Polk County line. It was then that the whole plane dipped hard to the right for just a moment and then leveled back out again. Out of the corner of my eye, I had seen why. Thanks to the pilot's quick thinking, something bright orange and glowing had bounced off the top right wing instead of slamming directly into the engine. I could see dots and blotches of orange on the wing, the engine cowling, and on my window. I had to assume the stuff was all over the side of the plane. I focused on the little orange blob on my window as the pilot came on the intercom.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain up on the flight deck. I want to apologize for that disturbance a few moments ago, but we had to dodge something that may have been a weather balloon or a drone of some sort. I've been told that there's orange paint out on our wing, but I assure you that all systems show green up here, and we have no mechanical damage. The controllers have given us clearance to continue to New York at my discretion."
The intercom clicked off for a moment, and I watched the little orange blob hold on to the window. The plane's airspeed alone should have pushed the little blob right off the outside surface, but it wasn't moving. I knew that it knew I was there, just out of its reach. The captain came back on.
"All right, folks, our flight time is 2 hours and 23 minutes to JFK. Due to the inconvenience you've endured, National Airlines has allocated one free alcoholic beverage on today's flight for each passenger 21 or older."
There were a few cheers, and then quiet returned to the cabin. I kept a watch on the orange blob. I did not take my eyes off it until we reached cruising altitude, and then I saw what I needed to see. At 27,000 feet, little ice crystals started to form inside the orange glowing goop. The DNA sapping, metamorphizing killer slime froze from the outside in and then fell off the plane. I watched out the window as more and more of it began to fall off the plane and into the night. Would it defrost when it hit the ground and start looking for prey? Or was freezing fatal to the little glowing bits of horror? It didn't matter entirely, though. I now knew what I needed to do to survive. The orange goop on the engine cowling was still there, warmed by the engine's intense heat and exhaust. As soon as we landed and the ground crew approached the right wing, everything that happened at Dean's would happen again on the tarmac at JFK. I had to be as far away as possible when that happened. I used my smartphone to book 2 airline tickets out of Fort Lauderdale to Bangor, Maine via Boston, leaving in the morning for my mom and her boyfriend. I knew that she was asleep already and that she turned off her phone every night, so I texted her the flight info. I implored her in my text to just trust me, to pack 2 bags, and to bring their credit cards and passports and to get on that flight. I told her that I would meet them in Bangor and that we'd be safe together. I then made my reservations for 2 rooms at the Holiday Inn in Bangor for 2 months. I knew that the temperatures there wouldn't average above freezing for the next 3 months. We'd survive. But I had to get off this plane quickly, and I was seated in the back of the plane. Pandemonium and mutations might begin outside the plane before I could get out. I would get caught in the turmoil and probably die here on the plane. I had to get to my car out in long-term parking and start heading north towards Maine as soon as we landed. "Mr. Seltzer." A light female voice with a distinct New York accent said my name questioningly. It startled me. I looked over to see a flight attendant talking to me. She was angelic, young, clear light brown skin, big brown eyes, brown hair that formed big looping natural curls that were backlit by someone's reading light across the aisle. A huge smile lit up the air around me, and I could see that she was pregnant. I nodded at her. "Mr. Setzer, we were advised that you were traveling for a family emergency. We have an empty seat up in the front row. Would you like to move up there so that you can be the first person off the plane when it lands?" There it was, my home run. The final piece to the puzzle, the Hail Mary that I needed. But it felt wrong. I thought about that orange goop attacking her and infiltrating her womb, changing the life inside her before it ever saw the light of day as a human being. I imagined the torture that she would experience in her last seconds of humanity, realizing that she was mutating, and so was her baby. I was debating on how to ask her to get off the plane with me, how I'd send her home in a rideshare car and tell her to take the next train north once she packed all her winter clothes. I had to convince her, but what could I say that sounded rational and trustworthy to the point where she'd abandon her job and follow a complete stranger out of the airport? No one would believe me about the orange glow. So, yes, thank you, was all I could muster. I moved up to the front row silently, leaving her to tend to the back of the cabin for the rest of the flight. I've never stopped hating myself since.